This notion of valley of death is something I play with. The best way I describe it is almost like a white line. All you have to do is step over it. It's not an easy step, and it's not a step that's for the faint-hearted, but having said that's all it is.
Hello, and welcome to the Entrepreneurship podcast series.
In this episode, Todd Davey speaks with Anthony Francis, Associate Vice President of Innovation, Commercialization, and Entrepreneurship at the University of Texas, San Antonio. Together, they unpack why universities still struggle to translate research into real-world value, challenge concepts like the Valley of Death, and explore how working backwards from the market and shifting from service models to value creation can unlock a much stronger commercialization pipeline.
Welcome, everybody. Good to have you with us. Today, we'll be speaking with Anthony Francis, an Associate Vice President of Innovation, Commercialization and Entrepreneurship at the University of Texas, San Antonio. He is formerly the founder and Managing Director of Technology Commercialization Group, a company that was acquired by Deloitte Australia. He was also the Executive Director at University of California, San Francisco Innovation Ventures, and the Managing Director at Flinders Ventures. He has also founded a games company and actually created one of Australia's most iconic board games. He's also been the producer of a cult art house film. Anthony Francis, welcome.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks so much for having me here. I guess even when I hear that background, it's pretty eclectic, isn't it? I don't even quite know how I'm here these days, but thanks for having me.
Well, that leads into my first question. How does someone go from creating hit games in a backwater of Australia to working as head of technology transfer at one of the biggest universities in the United States? And specifically, I wanted to pick up on the fact that you've landed in San Antonio, which for those Spanish native speakers, you'll understand that actually translates to Saint Anthony. I'm not sure if that was accidental or intentional, but how does that happen? Is that by accident, design?
Worse, because it came from San Francisco, which is St. Francis. Maybe the journey was set in stone before I even knew it. But going to your broader question, I think it's a good question and probably explains a lot in terms of how we've been thinking about tech transfer and how I think about tech transfer. Back when my original background is actually as an accountant, not as a scientist. And most folk in my role are scientifically trained or they're technically trained. Mine is quite the opposite. But as an accountant, you really are a historian. You basically try and work out what happened. And I have many clients come in and kind of ask me questions around what could I do to make things better? What could I do to make my products better? What could I do to actually get more revenue? And it's not a question I could answer. My training didn't give me that answer. It gave me the answer about how you could lose money, not necessarily how you could make money. So I decided the only real way to learn, I guess, turn the clock back 30, 40 years, was to actually do it myself. So that was what gave rise to the board game. And as most people with a good product, a technical product or a product that I thought could work in terms of being a bit of fun, there's a real journey to take that to market. It's not just something that you can sit there and say, let's get it out there and people will buy this. They don't. I learned a real process around that. The real process that I learned was really what to do next, not what to do. Everyone's got answers about what to do, but not what to do next. And I found that there was no one then giving that advice in that space. There was no one actually helping people with that question about what to do. As an accountant, I had my colleagues of lawyers and others that would tell innovators what to do, business plans, legal agreements, patents, all those sorts of things, but none of them really commercialized the product. All they did was give you more, I think, things to carry around and often baggage to carry around because they all cost money and it meant that it actually knocked you back. So I started TCG, which was a commercialization group that was supposed to blend those disciplines and also give you that what to do next type knowledge. Interestingly enough, I found that inventors in the wild, if you like, were not really great customers because they both didn't listen and they had no money. So if you think about a definition of a customer, it's the opposite of those two things. So where I found customers was really in research organizations, people that were motivated to actually get their things out to market, to make lives better, to make people and others experience the value of what they've been able to research. They also didn't mind paying, not a lot because they're universities, but they also didn't mind paying and they were interested in listening. And that journey then brought us to then think, there's all these collections of inventors, researchers and whatnot. What if we actually built some tools around that? What if we made it easier for people to actually get things to market? And that was really the essence of TCG. At the very same time, Deloitte looked at that and said, hey, we never thought about that as a market. We never thought about a university in that context. We thought about them as SaaS clients or clients in relation to bigger things. Deloitte stepped in and acquired us. And very much at that time, I found myself back in an accounting office, which was full circle. Maybe it's the St. Francis, St. Anthony thing again, but found myself back in an accounting office and then decided I should just go out and do this a bit more. And that led me to Flinders and then led me to UTSA and now down to San Antonio. But the journey's been very interesting.
Indeed.
But that whole idea of unlocking innovation has been the theme of the whole way through.
Yeah, and that is a consistent theme in your career. I can see that. And I think I believe you to be one of the great thinkers when it comes to technology transfer and this sort of space. And so I was interested to understand, when you reflect back on those 25 years, where are we at presently with technology transfer and how did we get here?
Yeah, not a lot's changed. I'm surprised at that. And I think it comes down to, and here's the accountant in me, saying that universities' revenue is really derived from students and research and not necessarily commercialization. They haven't made the extension yet that research and commercialization are hand in hand really with success. So with that in mind, I don't know whether it's got the attention it needs to at a university, really. I think that it hasn't necessarily changed a lot since I even started the journey in this space. Most universities, in my experience, start with the IP question and not the market question. Still, that's changed a lot over the years, I think. But still, I'd say the vast majority, certainly in the US, which is even more surprising, start with that IP first question. In other words, can we patent it? And that barrier is not a market barrier. It's a barrier of a technicality, not a barrier of whether someone would buy something or whether they would want something. That simple barrier coming down for a start is something that hasn't changed over the years. And the other thing that hasn't changed, I think, and it's a bit like, I don't know, any specialist profession, it hasn't really necessarily, the tech transfer profession hasn't really opened its arms necessarily to the broader entrepreneurship, innovation type managing folk that could manage these offices. As I said, I'm a little bit of an outlier because typically in my space, there is a scientific lead, and rightly so, they know the technology well, they know the technical side well, but they don't necessarily adapt well to that market for stuff. Where are we? It's a good question. We're still back to where we, I think, were that many years ago, where we're not seeing enough opportunities come through from research into commercialization. We're not seeing researchers understand how they could fit in the mix. They're sort of still standing back saying, I don't want to be an entrepreneur. I don't want to be a CEO. I might want to be a CEO. There's all that confusion. There's also still the confusion, I think, about the value of these startup companies and the hype that's around startup companies. In other words, everyone should be able to do this, or it's very interesting, or a pathway when it's actually very hard. It's not an easy pathway. And there's a bit of misconception, I think, around these startups. So I think we're not a lot further than what we were a long time ago. But I think there is an opportunity to change that. I really do.
You're not afraid of ruffling a few feathers at times. And when you named your games company Barking Spiders, now for all non-Australian listeners, feel free to look that up. I'm not going to explain it here what that means, but you've also said here the FUI factor. You've said FUI to the concept of Valley of Death. I just wanted to explore that a little bit more, because in your contribution, just for everyone's knowledge, we put out a publication just recently called The Future Universities Thought Book, focused on entrepreneurial universities, and Anthony has made a really valuable contribution talking about the FUI factor. And so I just wanted you to explain that a little bit about what that means in relation to the Valley of Death, but also to what degree you believe this is a self-inflicted wound created by universities.
It's a good question, and you're leading me down a dangerous path, which I don't mind. But this notion of Valley of Death is something I play with. I think you challenged me to write this article, and I thought it would be good to push the boundary a little on some of the terminology that's around. And I think Valley of Death's one that I've always struggled with. And market failure is the other one that I struggle with in terms of how that's wrapped up in the same sort of concept. It's hardly a valley of death, really, when you think about, what it is to cross the other side. So it's not a valley. It's the best way I describe it, and I was playing with this concept this morning, is almost like a white line. All you have to do is step over it. And on one side is technical value, and the other side is market value. It's not an easy step, and it's not a step that's for the faint-hearted. But having said, that's all it is. In my experience, almost always the market wants a couple of things, and a third thing, which I'll come to, but a couple of things for a start, and that is validation and leadership. They want to see that there is risk in the product or the technology because they want to see it validated either in a market or someone using it or whatever it might be. And they also want to see leadership. They almost know, markets know that a product going from one side of that white line to another is likely to fail. And if it's likely to fail, then the reality is leadership that's been there and done it before, or leadership that can cope with that failure, is what they're after. Most venture capitalists will tell you they don't want to have someone fail on their dime. They'd rather have it fail before, and then in fact they've learned from it. Failuring over here in the US isn't seen as a failure, it's seen as a success mark. In other words, that you can actually probably butter up the next time and be better at it. So those two things we know. We know that they're there. So it's hardly a value when we know that those two things are ingredients of success. And systematically, to your point, Todd, universities don't add them. So we've created it ourselves. If we don't add those two things that the market wants and we stand back and say that's market failure, it's not market failure. Market failure is where you don't know what that gap is. And market failure is also where there is genuine market failure, like monopolies or public-private type stuff, where things that the market just doesn't work with. This is the market's wanting to work with this. It just doesn't know how to engage with it. We're not adding the elements that make it worthwhile for the market to actually kind of address. The last part that I'd add there, and this is the X factor part that, I don't really talk about in terms of if I write something, but there's almost always another element that you can't see unless you're on the other side. In other words, there's what I call the trigger point. A customer is faced with many choices when they come to see your product, your service, your innovation on the other side. But what triggers them to buy yours rather than somebody else's? What lifts you up the preference list that they have in their mind when they're actually thinking about what to acquire? That third part is something you can only see from the other side of the white line. It doesn't occur on your side. It can't occur on your side. And that's the element of success. The first two parts are really things we know we need. The third is almost always peculiar to your product or service. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but it's hardly a value when we know that those things are necessary. And we can increase the chance of success all the way along that line without thinking too hard.
Yeah, one thing that you said in the article that I wanted to pick up, I wanted to start with failure, and then we're going to move on to how we can address this, what sort of measures can we take for success. But you said that this is universities approach this in a very linear way, as in there's basically a step-by-step approach, and then if there's no funding, then it dies. And they're often focused on selling patents. And so I just wanted you to reflect on that, just to say, why do you think universities keep using these sort of, I guess, their analogies or using this sort of approach, which time and again proves to be unsuccessful?
Yeah, I think it's a bit like a lottery win, or it's a bit like a good golf shot, right? You always keep coming back to the one that actually worked and think that, how can I just repeat that? And I think what we see in universities is that patents and particularly therapeutics don't follow that mold that I've just been talking about. They do, but they don't. And what I mean by that is you don't have someone with a preference list at the other end of the day saying, will I buy this one or that one? What you have is a sufferer, someone who actually has a condition or a problem or an issue that they need resolved, and a dedicated pathway through to that market, which includes patents, includes FDA, includes 4 or 5 life science distribution companies that have a very linear way of actually working. In other words, and rightly, that's for our safety. That's for making sure that a drug doesn't do what it's not intended to do, and it goes through a very regulated pathway. And so we all learn from that and think that's the way in which that we should commercialize everything. Patent it, work out whether it is safe, whether it's more technically interesting. And as I say, those pay off. Every now and then there's a blockbuster drug, and you'll find that a whole university can start telling the world that they've just about been funded by the one drug that they've been able to invent. So I think the issue is it's not horses for courses. In other words, there's one pathway that works for certain things, but the vast majority of projects at a university don't fit that pathway. If you think about the actual number of or the research dollars that come into a university, how much is therapeutic based versus how much is device based versus how much is just general innovation based? And therapeutics are typically less than half of the budget of a research university, which means that we're missing out on half of what actually could be innovation that could reach the market. And that journey, as I say, isn't easy, but that journey is a different journey to the one of drugs. And so, as I said, we get a bit addicted, or we get a bit thought up on, okay, that first pathway is the only way that we should be doing things, and let's just hunt for the gold. Let's look for the nuggets in the university rather than unlock the whole value of the university.
I just wanted to, because it's interesting, because we've done research on this over the years and looked at commercialization, and a specific study out of the US highlighted really clearly that why universities are interested in this, because over the last 25, 30 years, in terms of the money brought in from commercialization, it's exploded. However, it's really dominated by 15 universities in the US, and even if you look at Stanford, which is quite widely known for this particular process, then they're even they have only got a couple of massive hits that have really paid for everything else. So I guess that it leans into what you're saying, but I also want to. Let's move away from the university environment for a moment and what they're doing wrong. Maybe we can just talk a little bit about the concept that you raise in the article, which is, working backwards from the market. I'd love to hear you elaborate a little bit more on that and just explain to us what you mean by that and how does that practically work?
So it's a concept that, or not a concept, that we all know that the words sound easy. They are actually harder than what they are, but it's one of the things that we try and teach, or I certainly try and teach researchers, that process of working backwards from the market. It's not a natural state. It's basically a state where researchers and inventors alike are really trying to build a better product, build a better whatever it is that they're doing. When if they cross the line and they look back and they realize the elements they need to put in place to be successful, then they start building those things rather than necessarily the things that are marginally improving the product. In the course that we teach at the university, so, and we'll come back to this, I'm sure, but what are the steps you can take to make this whole process smoother? How can you run this better at a university? How can you run the whole process, even internally for yourself? If you've got an innovation, how can you run it better? One of the elements is to ready yourself for that. In other words, to be prepared or be ready or able to work backwards from the market. And we use an example in the course about making a film. And we usually, researchers and inventors alike, get the gist of it because they engage with something that's completely different to what it is that they're doing on a daily basis. So we try and make them make a film. In other words, invent something, make a film. And typically they go through the process. They say, yeah, we need a script, we need to find a director, we need to do all those things. So they're the marginal things. They're the things making the product better. When in fact, in filmmaking world, there's probably 3 or 4 distribution companies. They all tell you that there are a couple of things that sell a film. They're typically a thing called talkability, something to be able to talk about a film to somebody else. They also want to see a big star because that also drags people in. It's free publicity. Tom Cruise gets free publicity, whatever. So what they're doing is giving you the elements of success. They're saying, hey, if you come to me with a film that has these elements in, then I'm looking at it. And so suddenly you're working backwards from the market. The market's given you what it is that it needs to trigger itself to purchase your film. And you've got them. You've got the ingredients. You're just going to build them in. So no need to necessarily even get a script at this stage. There's no need to even get some of the things that you're thinking about that you need. What you need is to aim for those things that are closer to the market than you thought they were to actually trigger that purchase. But that notion, I know there's plenty of examples of that, but that notion of the market telling you what it was. Back in, you mentioned board games. I'll never forget going into a major department store buyer and showing him my game, which I thought was brilliant. And of course, my mum said it was brilliant and everyone around me said it was brilliant. And he basically told me to get out and I was an idiot. And the reason he said that I was an idiot because I didn't realize that he doesn't even care what the game looks like or even sounds or plays. What he cares about is that it's going to move off his shelf. And moving off his shelf meant a TV commercial. And a TV commercial is going to cost X amount of money. It was then that element. How do I build that in without necessarily paying for it was the next question. So it's trying to work out what that element is and then working backwards. No need to continually improve your product at that point. Maybe come back to that later, but let's see if we can get these other things in place.
The UIIN Conference 2026, where universities, industry, and innovators meet to shape the future. Join us in Stockholm for 3 days of insight, inspiration, and impact. Hear from global thought leaders, expand your network, and be part of the conversations driving collaboration forward. Submit your abstract and secure your place now at uiin.org/conference.
Yeah, if we had more time, I'd love you to expand on Rolf de Heer's movie that he created, working backward for the market. Yeah, as if we had more time. For anyone that wants to check that out, please feel free to go and check out how Quiet Room came about. Just in terms of some of the other things that you advocated for in the article, I just wanted you to maybe talk to us a little bit about the idea you had around the production line for new technologies and just what the stations or parts of this production line might include.
It's a question I'm playing with right now. Getting to, I wouldn't say the end, I'm going to say a refresh or a new part of my career. I've loosened up on a few things. Generally speaking, this notion of how do we make that flow? How do we make the innovation flow from researcher to ultimate user or benefactor is the question I'm playing with a lot these days. And I think AI has changed things, by the way. I think we're in a new world where we have an opportunity to change things for the better if we get it right. And I think this is one of the greatest examples of how AI could actually create value and create jobs rather than what everyone's fear is, which is that it could take away jobs. The thinking we've got at the moment, or the thinking that we're playing with at the moment, is to put the tools of market research or the tools of that market voice in the hands of a researcher. How do I get that voice to someone who's in a cocoon right now? And one of the ways we've done that, and I could probably put it in the chat if you're interested, is we've put a little commercialization coach out, which is where the researcher puts in their idea, puts in their research outcome. And what it does is it tries to convert that research outcome into a product, into something that could be tested, could be out, have that conversation out with the market. Would you buy this? Could you distribute this or whatever? And then find that missing piece. So in other words, facilitate that journey. So what I think the tricks are, or the steps are, coming back a way, is to put some education in for the researcher to actually understand the process. They don't have to be an entrepreneur. They don't have to be anything other than what they are, but just get the fact that this is how it works and understand that there is technical world and there's market world, and they exist in one world, maybe a little in the other, but they just need to know where they fit. So there's that fit part. Secondly, the idea of giving that tool to a researcher right from the word go. In other words, how can we give them those tools to actually see and picture their product from the market back? How can they work that through? And then thirdly, I think it's positioning a tech transfer office, not to be so much a tech transfer office, but to be a developer, to sit there and say, okay, we get what's missing. How do we get an entrepreneur in residence program? How do we get an entrepreneur to this team? How do we add validation? We're a university, for goodness sake. We should be able to get validation inside our own walls if we can. How do we add the elements of success to these projects? And then how do we build the university to having a little equity position in all of them? If you think about that, just in terms of wandering your mind forward, and I'm pretty sure it was MIT, missed out on Apple. I mean, what if they had a small percentage of Apple? There was no innovation that you would have seen at that time that you could patent. There would have been well and truly a good designer and a good process inside the university. Stanford got lucky with Google. They happened to patent an algorithm. They didn't actually think about it in the way that they should have, which is how do we get this company up and how do we take a small percentage of it just on the way through for the effort that we're about to do, and also to return to the taxpayer what it is that we can have this innovation cycle to generate value for our economy. So steps are get the researcher kind of a little aligned, give the researcher the tools at the moment, that's what we're playing with, and build, if you like, down at the development end, the value adding end, not necessarily the judgment end.
Now, one of the things that you're doing at UTSA is working with a studio model. I'd be interested for you to just explain how that works and how you're approaching that for others, because I think it would really help them to how they think about their own operations.
So just in terms of researchers, or what were you thinking about there? Sorry.
Just in terms of the studio model that you've created at UTSA.
Okay. Sorry, yeah. For some reason, it came through a student model. I couldn't work it out. But anyway, the studio model, yeah. So the idea there is pushing, if you think about pushing the tech transfer office down the pike a little. So pushing them down a little to say, okay, we're interested in making sure that the right projects come through, prioritizing, but also working with programs like the EIR program, like a validation system, and then also building studios that actually have commercial partnerships attached to them. So the best example I can give you is our AI studio, which is where we have a company that sits alongside us that is happy to put in 10 grand in their platform to see if they can convert these ideas that come through that process into more product-like prototype things that can be tested. My favorite example of that is that we have one bit of research that came out that on its own would have looked very ordinary. It's basically saying the thrust of the research was if you rehabilitate prisoners a little better once they leave jail, then you have a better chance of them not coming back into jail. Now, to my mind, I wonder where that research actually was funded from, because it didn't sound very rocket science to me. Having said that, the researcher had picked up a whole lot of really interesting traits and things that were important in that journey. But working with the AI company meant that she developed an app that actually connected the prisoner, or the ex-prisoner now, with their parole officer to be able to monitor them better, to give them education, to also interject when they needed it, at the time in which they needed it. In other words, they were thinking about not necessarily reoffending, but going back to bad community groups or things that that were important at that time. To be able to deliver just in time help to that person became really interesting. And when it was then shown to the prison authorities and the state counties here, they're kind of like, we could use that for DUI, we could use that for other things, we could use that to rehabilitate folk that might be interesting. This notion of being able to push them through that way, getting a market hook, and then in a studio sense, developing up a product that actually someone wants, and with commercial partners, so that they also have motivated to push it in the right direction. There, it's almost like a natural bumper car. You're in a natural kind of space that means everyone's motivated to get it to market. So they're the sorts of studios we're building at the end: a device studio, an AR studio, and those sorts of things.
That's a great segue into one of the other concepts that you introduced in your article, which is the circle of value. You talk about the university shifting from a service provider to an investor or a stakeholder. Perhaps you can just explain that and maybe some of the hurdles that you can imagine within a university context.
Yeah, that comes with some challenges. The notion of this, if you think about, and I'll bring the accountant out of me, if you're going to be successful in this space, then what it ends up looking is the university should have a whole stack of equity in companies that they create. And the good news about that is it takes the emphasis off royalties, meaning that you get a share of the actual value of the company rather than a share of the technology value, which is a much broader concept, but a better concept in many ways than what we've been pushing for as universities for many years. So if you think about that endpoint as being, we would like a good equity portfolio, and I'll come back to the proof of that at UCSF, but you need to have a circle that pushes you around that point. So it also means you have to think about yourself almost a little like a venture capitalist. That is, that you're actually pushing from this service provider model, which a university is very well used to, and a cost-driven model where you're there to help the researcher, to one that says, hey, we're here to help the researchers that want to help themselves and also want to go on the journey with us, and there is a market need for what they're doing. So it means that through that circle, you're often saying not necessarily no, but not yet, or hey, this is not going to work through this process. So you're moving from more a developer to what you are, a service provider, which means the decisions about what resources you apply to things become more yours rather than what the researcher wants or demands. So that's got challenges at a university, particularly where they're used to service provision. They're used to talking to the research office and getting what they want. They're very much used to getting the way in which they want to deal with something in a traditional form. You actually are shifting the culture a little bit of a university to shifting it towards only choosing those projects or working with those projects around a market kind of first approach. And so if you work around this circle of value, then you end up with equity. In other words, if I want to have equity in companies, then I've got to be a developer in those companies. I've also got to be an introducer of partners to those companies. I've got to add value to the company on the whole way through if I want to be an equity holder. So doing one of the simple things like the EAR program at UCSF led to UCSF having simply from about 40 or 30 million, I think was around a value of equity when I started 5 years before, to 240, 250 million in equity at the end. And why is that? Simply by having that more general approach to going through the process, adding what's necessary, and taking 5 or 10% equity along the way has been the way that sort of works. But yeah, it's a different culture, and universities don't necessarily fit with it. They also, researchers tend to jump the queue. They're used to getting their way, so they tend to find a way around you, speak to the chancellor, speak to whatever, to try and get what they want out of you. So those all come with challenges and ways of doing things.
There's a lot of questions appearing in the chat, so I'm going to refer to one from Gunther Schmidt. And he has asked, how does market-driven innovation gel with academic freedom expectations of academics?
I think they're two, they go hand in hand. I mean, in reality, most of the commercialization stuff that you do, if it's not around a patent, is pretty well academic freedom anyway. And most cases I'm just trying to think of a couple of cases right now where those questions come up, and they're healthy questions, because there's that tension between how do I get this out to market and how do I have freedom around what it is that I'm doing. And that happens a lot in software these days. I'm finding a lot more of that people want their tool to be used. They want it to be out there in the marketplace. And the two don't necessarily they're not competitive, I don't think. If you get the reality around, we want people to use this. So forget about that commercialization question. It's a bit like that crossing the chasm thing. It's a bit like the valley of death. Commercialization is the outcome. Use is what you're after. And the method by which you then profit from it is commercialization. So the first question is, how do I get this used more? How do I get this out in the marketplace? And then secondly, how do I make money from it, or how do I make it reinvestable so that we can actually keep the activity going? And you should be surprised that those two questions are more often than not hand in hand if you just separate them the right way. In terms of academic freedom, it's an interesting question though, because it's one that pops up, but as I say, you drill into the detail and you wonder whether there is actually that question. It's more a perception than a question. It happens certainly in therapeutics because there is academic constraint sometimes around that sort of stuff. But again, for the right reason, because you're giving a funnel by which you can get more money for it. In other words, there's no way you'd get more money for it unless you put it through that process. There's a reason for doing so. So most times it's easily answered by the reason for doing it rather than necessarily the tension. It's more, as I said, it's more a perception than what it is a reality. I don't think I've ever had one situation where, even in all my career, where you've actually sat down and dug out those issues and then worked out, well, there really isn't much of a conflict. It's a bit like conflict of interest. When you dig it right down, often there isn't much one of one.
I'm going to refer to another question, this time from Medisa Fokic, who's a PhD candidate doing some really interesting research in Europe looking at intellectual property at universities. Her question is, how realistic is the fail fast, scale fast mindset for university-based startups? What does healthy failure actually look like in this context?
I think it's real, but the good news is if you get those little structures along the way right, you know why you failed. And that's the most important part. It's much better to do a whole lot of little experiments to get to market, like commercial experiments, to get a whole lot of little commercial experiments out to market than to build some corporation that's going to fail. And if you've got that process where you're winding around that circle and you've got studios and whatnot, you're actually essentially making those experiments, those commercial experiments. The jail one I spoke about would have had 30 or 40 meetings with the prison authorities to actually try and get those things in there. They failed many times, but you wouldn't have seen it. They're like micro failures. In other words, I wouldn't buy that because, and then boom, you've got the answer or you've got a clue about the next step. It's almost like a puzzle through that process. So the answer is, I'd like to fail even faster, but fail on a smaller scale completely with knowing what it is or the reason why you're failing, so that you can either import it or, sometimes let it go. Sometimes it's just not worth the shove, if you like, to get it to that point. Almost always it is, because you find some reason to do a partner with someone or do something interesting that's a bit more different than what you're doing right now. But sometimes it's not too.
One of the things I've loved about today's conversation, Anthony, is when you talk about the research and the work that universities are doing, your face lights up with that enthusiasm. I can see within you that there's a great belief in university as well as research and the impact that it can make. In fact, in your article, you said that it's one of the greatest opportunities of our time. Perhaps you could just lean into that and explain, what is this latent potential that you're referring to?
Well, I think I'll give you some good examples, but I think if that even the maths one of saying, we've got all this research going through our universities, but how much value is actually coming out? And I think that's the thing that drives my thinking around this stuff, that there's an untapped opportunity. In a sports analogy, you've got so many shots about to go on goal, but you can't seem to get it past the halfway mark, which is crazy. We've got all of this research, all this innovation, all this knowledge sitting with folk, and they're enjoying themselves on the technical side. But what if we could release that to the world? In a good example of UT San Antonio is that 40% of our portfolio right now is made up of non-IP related projects. We've got 176 projects coming through the pike, which means we've kind of unlocked it. We've unlocked what it is that is there. Now, the next problem is, how the hell do you get them through the other end? In other words, are you creating a rod for your back if you unlock this thing? But I think that one problem at a time. Let's see if we can get it out and see how we then solve the next one, because that's a problem to be solved. But yeah, this notion of being able to get a flow through, get the universities being much more relevant, much more connected, much more drivers of economic value in a community. They're the things that keep me going. And even in my career so far, I haven't seen it done super well yet. So it's like unfinished business. And I'm hopeful of AI. I'm hopeful of a few other things that maybe times are changing.
There's some great reflections there, and I want to give you the opportunity to make one more. Love you to wrap up the conversation by trying to crystallize that, all of what we've discussed today, into maybe some next steps for if you're talking to either a university leader or somebody in technology commercialization. Is it a frame of mind how they should think about commercialization, or is there some next step that you could give everybody as an outtake for this conversation today?
I think if it was evidence-based, if it was like my history, I'm going to answer this two ways. The first is the past and the next is the future, right? The first is the past. And the one thing that really has always stood out in, I guess, my career is educating researchers. And I know that sounds dumb, but essentially having this notion of making your research a 5 or 10% commercial, not necessarily 100% commercial, but 5 or 10%, because 5 or 10% commercial across all of your researchers or all of your innovators at a university is a big number. And that means that you have a better chance of success. And simply by doing that, you find that that's enough to get things all the way through. The future, if you like, and so then you have to build all the processes we talked about today, the interesting parts, the circle of value, the ways of doing things. But the interesting part is the future. I think that if we can democratize commercialization, that would be interesting. How do we democratize innovation? How do we give the researchers the tools to actually do some of that market first stuff back? How do we position our tech transfer officers so they are adding value rather than being kind of patent attorneys? How do we think about that? That's the future in my mind is there. And I'm more enthusiastic than ever to see if we can get some of those things to happen with some of the changes we've seen in the world over the last little while.
And I think that's a great way to wrap up. Such an inspiring way to finish there, Anthony. Thank you so much. For those of you that are following UIN, we have our conference upcoming in Stockholm on the 15th to 17th of June. We also have a number of different training programs, including Building Effective University Business Collaboration, which is happening in May, Developing Strategic Partnerships, which is happening in a live setting in September. So feel free to check out the UIN website and see what's coming up. Again, Anthony, thank you for your contribution today. It was fantastic to chat with you, get those insights, and looking forward to our next conversation.
Thanks, Todd. And I just popped my email there so that if anyone wants to follow up any of those things or wants any more information or wants our course or wants anything that we're up to, go ahead. You just email me.
Thanks again, Anthony.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to today's discussion. Follow UIN on LinkedIn, and if you're enjoying our podcast, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review in your podcast platform of choice to help other people find this content too.